On the night of December 26, 1898, Michael, Norah, and Ellen Murphy left their home together, speaking in low tones as they prepared for the evening's dance. Their clothing was neat, their movements practiced, their mood untouched by the hours to come. By dawn, all three would be found lifeless, placed with a precision that defied sense, and not a single word they spoke that night would ever be heard again. Let us know which country or state you are listening from. Our voices travel farther than the horse tracks of Gatton ever could. The Murphy house was quiet as the siblings readied themselves. Michael, the eldest, moved with a kind of careful economy, his hands steady as he buttoned his collar, his eyes flicking to the clock and then to his sister's. Norah, her hair pinned with more care than usual, glanced at Ellen in the looking glass, her lips pressed together in a line that was neither smile nor frown. Ellen, the youngest, fussed with her gloves, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her excitement. Their mother watched from the doorway, arms folded, her gaze lingering on each child in turn. She said little, only reminding Michael to mind the horses and Norah to keep her shawl close. The father, already half turned away, muttered something about the hour, but his voice was lost in the shuffle of boots and the soft click of the latch. As they stepped outside, Michael offered his arm to Norah, who accepted with a nod, her eyes lowered. Ellen followed, pausing to look back at the house, her expression unreadable in the dim light. The three of them moved together, not quite in step, but close enough that their shadows merged on the ground. At the dance, the hall was already alive with voices and the scrape of chairs. Michael greeted the men he knew with a brief nod, his words few and measured. Norah and Ellen exchanged glances, their faces brightening as they recognized friends among the crowd. Norah's laughter, when it came, was soft and quick, vanishing almost as soon as it appeared. Ellen's smile lingered longer, but she kept close to her sister, her hand brushing Norah's sleeve whenever someone new approached. They danced, but not often. Michael stood at the edge of the room, his arms folded, watching the floor with a gaze that seemed to look through the dancers rather than at them. When he did speak, it was in a low voice, his words directed only to those who came near. Norah accepted a dance from a young man with a shy, practiced curtsy, her eyes darting to Michael as she moved away. Ellen, when asked, hesitated before nodding, her cheeks flushed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Between dances, the siblings gathered near the wall, their heads close together. Their conversation was quiet, their words lost in the hum of the room. Now and then, Norah would touch Michael's arm, her fingers lingering as if to anchor herself. Ellen watched the door, her gaze flickering each time it opened, her lips moving in silent count. Others noticed them, of course. The Murphys were known, and their presence drew the occasional glance, a nod, a whispered remark. A neighbor's wife remarked on how grown the girls had become, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. Michael heard, but did not respond, his jaw tightening for a moment before he looked away. As the evening wore on, the siblings' movements grew slower, their laughter less frequent. Michael checked his watch, the gesture sharp and final. Norah gathered her shawl, her hands smoothing the fabric with deliberate care. Ellen stood a little apart, her eyes on the floor, her mouth set in a line of resolve. When it was time to leave, they did so without ceremony. Michael thanked the host with a brief formal word, his tone polite but distant. Norah offered a smile, her eyes shadowed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellen nodded to a friend, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Outside, the three paused for a moment, their breath visible in the cool air. Michael looked at his sisters, his expression unreadable, then gestured toward the waiting sulky. Norah climbed in first, her movements careful, her skirt gathered close. Ellen followed, glancing once more at the hall, her face pale in the lamplight. As Michael took the reins, Norah settled beside him, her hands folded in her lap. Ellen sat on the other side, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, broken only by the distant sound of laughter from the hall. Then Michael clicked his tongue, and the horses moved forward. The siblings sat close, their shoulders nearly touching, their faces turned away from one another. Behind them, the hall faded into darkness, the last echoes of music swallowed by the night. No one who watched them go could have guessed what waited on the road ahead. Their departure was unremarkable, their goodbyes brief, their faces composed. Yet in the way Nora's hand lingered on Michael's arm, in the way Ellen's eyes darted to the shadows, in the way Michael's jaw set as he looked back at the hall, there was something unspoken, a tension that would not be named. They rode away together, three figures joined by blood and habit, their words and gestures already slipping beyond the reach of memory. Those who saw them last would remember only fragments, a glance, a half-finished sentence, the way Ellen's hand trembled as she adjusted her glove. The rest would be lost, carried away on the silent road, never to be spoken aloud again. The road behind the dance hall was empty but for the sound of the sulky's wheels and the soft, uneven rhythm of the horses' hooves. Michael held the reins with both hands, his posture upright, his eyes fixed ahead. Norah sat beside him, her shawl drawn close, her fingers twisting the fringe in small, nervous motions. Ellen, on the far side, leaned forward just enough to peer into the darkness, her lips parted as if she might speak, but thought better of it. For a time, none of them said anything. The silence between them was not unfriendly, but it was dense, as if each was listening for something only they could hear. Michael cleared his throat, a small, habitual sound, and Norah glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "You needn't drive so fast," she said, her voice low, almost apologetic. Michael did not answer, but his grip on the reins loosened, and the horses slowed. Ellen shifted in her seat, her hands folded in her lap. "Did you see Mrs. O'Reilly's dress?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes did not meet her sister's. Norah smiled, a brief, private thing. "I did. She must have borrowed it from her cousin in Toowoomba. It was too fine for a place like this." Michael's mouth twitched, the closest he came to a smile that night. They rode on, the conversation faltering, each remark trailing off into silence. Norah looked back over her shoulder, the dance hall now just a faint glow behind them. "I wish we could have stayed longer," she said, almost to herself. Michael's reply was a grunt, not unkind, but final. Ellen's gaze flickered between her siblings, her expression uncertain. As they passed the last house on the edge of town, a figure stepped out from the gate, lantern in hand. It was Mr. Baker, the storekeeper, his face half-lit, his eyes squinting against the darkness. "Safe journey, Murphys," he called, his voice carrying in the stillness. Michael raised a hand in acknowledgement but did not slow. Norah offered a polite, "Good night," her words barely audible. Ellen managed a small wave, her fingers fluttering before she let her hand fall. The lantern's glow faded behind them, and the road stretched on, empty and unmarked. Norah leaned closer to Michael, her voice a whisper. "Do you think Mother will wait up?" Michael shook his head. "She never does." Ellen's voice, when it came, was softer still. "I hope she left the lamp in the window." Norah reached across and squeezed her hand, a gesture so quick it might have been missed. They fell quiet again, the only sounds the creak of the sulky and the horses' steady breathing. Michael's jaw worked as if he were chewing over something unsaid. Norah watched him, her eyes searching his face for a sign, but he kept his gaze fixed on the road. Ellen hummed a tune under her breath, the melody thin and wavering, fading each time she caught herself. A little further on, they passed a pair of young men walking home from the dance, their laughter echoing in the night. One called out, "Good night, Murphys." Michael nodded, his reply a wordless sound. Norah smiled, but did not speak. Ellen shrank back, her face hidden in shadow. The men's voices faded and the siblings were alone again. Norah broke the silence. "Did you see how Mr. Hanley looked at you, Ellen?" Ellen's cheeks colored, and she shook her head. "He didn't." Norah's smile was gentle, teasing. "He did. He asked after you twice." Michael's eyes flicked to Ellen, then away. "He's not for you," he said, his tone flat. Ellen said nothing, her hands tightening in her lap. They rode on, the conversation stalling, each sibling turning inward. Michael's shoulders were tense, his eyes narrowed. Nora's fingers traced patterns on her skirt, her thoughts elsewhere. Ellen watched the shadows, her breath shallow, her posture rigid. As they neared the turnoff to the paddock, a dog barked in the distance, sharp and sudden. All three started, the horses shying before Michael calmed them with a word. Norah laughed, the sound brittle. "Just a dog," she said, but her voice trembled. Ellen looked at Michael, her eyes wide. "We're nearly home," she whispered, as if to reassure herself. They said little after that. The road seemed longer than before, the darkness pressing in. Michael's face was set, his jaw clenched. Nora's hand found Ellen's again, their fingers entwined. Ellen's eyes never left the shadows at the edge of the track. The last person to see them alive was a drover named Thomas Wilson, who passed them at the crossroads. He tipped his hat, his greeting polite but brief. Michael nodded. Norah offered a quiet, "Good evening," and Ellen managed a faint smile. Wilson would later recall the way they sat, close together, their faces pale in the moonlight, their voices low and careful. After that, there were no more words, no more witnesses. The sulky rolled on, the three siblings pressed close, their thoughts their own. Whatever passed between them in those final moments was carried away with the night, leaving only silence in its wake. Morning came with a hush that felt unnatural, as if the world itself was waiting for something to be set right. In the Murphy house, the usual sounds of waking, footsteps on the boards, the clatter of the kettle, the low voices of children, were subdued, each movement careful, each word measured. Their mother was the first to notice the absence, her eyes flicking to the clock, then to the empty places at the table. She said nothing at first, only pressed her lips together and poured tea with a hand that trembled just enough to spill a drop. The father, Patrick, moved through the house with a growing impatience, his boots heavy on the floor. He asked after Michael, Norah, and Ellen, his voice gruff, but the question hung in the air unanswered. The younger children watched him, their faces pale, their eyes wide and uncertain. One of the boys, Thomas, slipped outside to check the yard, his shoulders hunched, his steps slow. He returned shaking his head, his mouth set in a thin, worried line. By mid-morning, the unease had settled over the house like a fog. The mother stood at the window, her hands twisting the edge of her apron, her gaze fixed on the empty road. Patrick paced the kitchen, muttering to himself, his anger thinly masking something deeper. The children spoke in whispers, their voices trailing off whenever an adult entered the room. It was Norah's absence that seemed to trouble the mother most. She moved from room to room, touching Norah's shawl, smoothing the coverlet on her bed, pausing to stare at the hairbrush left on the dresser. She called Ellen's name once, softly, as if expecting an answer from the next room. When none came, she pressed her hand to her mouth and closed her eyes. Patrick's worry turned to action. He sent Thomas to the neighbors, his instructions clipped and urgent. Ask if they saw them come home. Ask if anyone heard the sulky. Thomas nodded, his face set, and hurried out the door. The mother watched him go, her hands clenched at her sides. Neighbors arrived in twos and threes, their faces drawn, their voices low. Mrs. O'Reilly, her bonnet askew, offered a tight-lipped comfort, her eyes darting from the mother to the empty chairs. Mr. Hanley, hat in hand, stood awkwardly by the door, his gaze fixed on the floor. They might have stayed with friends, he suggested, but his tone was uncertain, his words falling flat. The search began with a kind of desperate order. Patrick led the way, his jaw set, his eyes hard. The men fanned out along the road, calling the siblings' names, their voices echoing in the stillness. The women remained behind, gathering in the kitchen, their hands busy with teacups and handkerchiefs, their conversation a murmur of worry and speculation. As the hours passed, the tension grew. Each time a figure appeared on the road, the mother straightened, hope flickering in her eyes, only to fade as the searchers returned empty-handed. The children watched from the doorway, their faces pressed together, their whispers sharp with fear. Patrick's anger gave way to something quieter, a kind of hollow dread. He spoke less, his instructions fewer, his movements slower. When he returned from the far paddock, his shoulders were slumped, his face gray with exhaustion. He sat at the table, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the door. The mother moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps silent, her face drawn. She paused at the window, her breath fogging the glass, her eyes searching the horizon. When Mrs. O'Reilly offered tea, she shook her head, her lips pressed tight. "They should have come home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. By midday, the neighbors had spread the word. Men from nearby farms arrived, their faces grim, their voices clipped. They spoke in low tones, their eyes meeting and then sliding away. The search party grew, the men moving out in pairs, their boots leaving tracks in the dust. The women gathered the children, keeping them close, their hands gentle but firm. The Murphy house was filled with the sound of waiting, chairs scraping, doors opening and closing, the low hum of anxious voices. The mother sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving the road. Patrick stood in the yard, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When the first sign came, a sulky wheel track veering off the main road, there was a sudden, breathless silence. The men gathered, their faces set, their voices hushed. Patrick led the way, his steps quickening, his shoulders squared. The others followed, their eyes on the ground, their mouths set in grim lines. The mother watched them go, her face pale, her hands trembling. She did not speak, did not move, only stared after them until they disappeared from view. The children clustered around her, their eyes wide, their voices silent. In the hush that followed, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for news that would not bring comfort, only an end to the waiting. The searchers moved on, their figures growing smaller in the distance, their voices lost to the wind. The mother sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the empty road, her heart already knowing what her mind refused to accept. The men walked in a line, their boots muffled in the grass, each one glancing at the others as if to measure the fear in their faces. Patrick Murphy led, his jaw clenched, his eyes refusing to meet those behind him. Mr. Hanley followed, his hat in his hands, turning it over and over, the brim growing damp with sweat. Thomas, the eldest Murphy boy left at home, trailed close, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his gaze fixed on the ground. No one spoke as they followed the sulky's tracks, the line of wheels cutting away from the main road, veering toward the open paddock. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the occasional cough or the snap of a twig underfoot. When the tracks ended, the men stopped as one, their bodies tense, their eyes drawn to the shapes ahead. At first, it was only a sense of wrongness, a stillness that did not belong, a hush that pressed against the ears. Patrick's hand went up, a wordless command, and the others halted behind him. He took a step forward, then another, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Mr. Hanley's lips moved, forming a prayer he did not finish. The bodies were arranged with a care that made the men hesitate. Michael lay on his back, his arms at his sides, his face turned toward the sky. Norah and Ellen were close by, their dresses smoothed, their hair brushed away from their faces. There was no sign of struggle, no wildness in their posture, only a deliberate, unnatural order, as if someone had paused to consider each detail. Patrick's breath caught in his throat. He knelt beside Michael, his hands hovering above his son's chest, not daring to touch. His face twisted, but he made no sound. Thomas stood behind him, his fists clenched, his eyes wide and unblinking. Mr. Hanley turned away, his shoulders shaking, his hat falling to the ground. The other men hung back, their faces pale, their mouths set in hard lines. One of them, a neighbor named O'Connell, stepped forward, then stopped, his hand raised as if to ward off something unseen. "We should fetch the police," he said, his voice rough, but no one moved. Patrick reached out, his fingers brushing Michael's sleeve. He drew back as if burned, his hand trembling. "Don't touch them," he said, his voice hoarse. "Don't move anything." The words hung in the air, final and absolute. Thomas knelt beside his father, his breath coming in gasps. He looked at Norah, her face peaceful, her hands folded in her lap. He reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering above hers. "She looks asleep," he whispered, his voice breaking. Patrick shook his head, his eyes fixed on the ground. Mr. Hanley straightened, wiping his face with his sleeve. He looked at the others, his eyes red. "We need to tell the constable," he said, his voice steadier now. "No one should see this but the police." The men nodded, their faces grim, their bodies stiff with shock. They stood in a loose circle, none willing to step closer, none willing to look away. The arrangement of the bodies held them at a distance, a silent warning that none dared to cross. The air was thick with the things they could not say, the questions that pressed at their throats, the horror that settled in their bones. Patrick rose slowly, his movements heavy. He looked at his children, his face hollow, his eyes empty. "We leave them as they are," he said, his voice flat. "We wait for the police." The others nodded, relief and dread mingling in their faces. As they turned to go, Thomas lingered, his gaze fixed on Norah's face. He reached out once more, his fingers brushing her hair, then drew back, his shoulders shaking. Mr. Hanley put a hand on his shoulder, guiding him away, his own face set in a mask of grief. The men walked back in silence, their steps slow, their bodies hunched. No one spoke of what they had seen, no one dared to break the hush that followed them. When they reached the road, Patrick stopped, his eyes on the horizon. "We tell no one but the police," he said, his voice low. "No one goes near them until the constable comes." The others agreed, their voices barely more than whispers. They parted at the crossroads, each man turning toward his own home, his own family, his own silence. Patrick and Thomas walked together, their shoulders touching, their faces set. Neither looked back. At the Murphy house, the mother waited at the window, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes searching the road. When she saw the men returning, she rose, her breath catching. Patrick met her gaze, his face telling her everything before he spoke a word. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her body swaying, her eyes filling with tears she would not let fall. Inside, the children gathered around her, their faces pale, their voices hushed. No one asked what had been found. No one needed to. The silence in the house was answer enough. Outside, the men stood in the yard, their heads bowed, their voices low. They spoke of the police, of what must be done, of what must not be said. Their words were careful, their eyes wary, as if the arrangement in the paddock had followed them home, settling over their shoulders like a shadow that would not lift. And in the paddock, the bodies remained as they had been left, silent, still and waiting. The constable arrived with a measured tread, his uniform pressed, his face set in a mask of official calm. He greeted Patrick with a nod, his eyes flicking to the men gathered in the yard, reading their faces for what they would not say aloud. He asked for the way, and Patrick led him, his voice stripped of all but the barest facts, his words clipped and spare. The men followed at a distance, their steps slow, their eyes lowered. No one spoke as they approached the paddock. The constable paused at the edge, his gaze sweeping the scene, his hands folded behind his back. He did not move forward at once, but stood in silence, his eyes narrowing as he took in the arrangement. He stepped carefully, his boots leaving shallow prints in the grass. He circled the bodies, his breath held, his face unreadable. He knelt beside Michael, his gloved hand hovering above the chest, not touching, only observing. He looked at Norah and Ellen, his eyes lingering on the way their hands were placed, the way their hair had been smoothed. He said nothing for a long time. Patrick stood apart, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. The constable rose, dusting his knees, and turned to the men. "No one has moved them?" he asked, his tone even. Patrick shook his head. "Not a soul." The constable nodded, his lips pressed thin. He walked the perimeter, his eyes searching the ground for signs, a scuff, a print, a mark in the earth. He crouched, examining the sulky, the harness, the scattered belongings. He picked up a glove, turning it over in his hand, then set it down with care. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each gesture might disturb something fragile. The men watched him, their faces tense, their bodies rigid. The constable asked questions in a low voice. Who found them? Who else had been here? Had anyone seen strangers on the road? Each answer was given in the same flat tone, each man careful not to say more than he must. He called for a notebook, and one of the men fetched it from the sulky. The constable wrote in small, precise script, pausing now and then to glance at the bodies, his brow furrowed. He asked about the dance, about the last time the siblings were seen, about the route they would have taken. The answers came in fragments, each man offering what he remembered, each detail weighed and measured. He stood for a long time, silent, his eyes moving from one face to another. He asked Patrick to describe the siblings' habits, their friends, their enemies. Patrick's answers were brief, his voice rough. They had no enemies, he said, his eyes fixed on the ground. The constable made a note, his face giving nothing away. He called the men closer, his voice low. No one is to touch them. No one is to speak of what they have seen, not until I have finished here. The men nodded, their faces pale, their eyes averted. The constable returned to the bodies, kneeling once more, his hands steady, his breath slow. He examined the arrangement, the way the clothing had been smoothed, the way the limbs were placed. He looked for marks, for signs of struggle, for anything that might explain the careful order. He found little, no tracks but their own, no sign of pursuit, no evidence of haste or panic, only the bodies laid out with a care that chilled the blood. He stood, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed. He called for a sheet, and the men brought one from the sulky. He covered the bodies, his hands gentle, his movements slow. He turned to Patrick, his voice softer now. "I am sorry," he said, and for a moment the mask slipped, and the grief in his eyes was plain. The men stood in silence, their hats in their hands, their faces set. The constable gathered his things, his notebook tucked away, his gloves removed with care. He spoke to Patrick in a low voice, his words meant for no one else. Patrick nodded, his shoulders sagging, his eyes hollow. The constable walked back to the road, his steps heavy, his face pale. The men followed, their voices hushed, their eyes on the ground. No one spoke of what they had seen. No one dared to break the silence that clung to them. At the house, the constable wrote his report, his pen scratching across the page. He asked more questions, his tone gentle, his manner patient. The answers came slowly. Each word weighed, each memory examined for meaning. The mother sat in the corner, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the floor. The children watched from the doorway, their faces white, their voices silent. The constable finished his report, closed his notebook, and stood. He looked at Patrick, his expression grave. "We will do what we can," he said, his voice steady. Patrick nodded, his lips pressed tight, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The constable left, his figure receding down the road, his shadow long in the afternoon light. The men watched him go, their faces drawn, their bodies weary. The silence remained, heavy and unbroken, settling over the house, the yard, the paddock where the bodies lay. No one spoke of what they had seen. No one slept that night. The arrangement in the grass haunted their thoughts, a question with no answer, a fear that would not be named. In the days that followed, the constable's questions spread through the district like a chill. Each man and woman who had known the Murphys was called upon, their words weighed, their faces studied for the smallest flicker of guilt or knowledge. The police asked about old quarrels, debts unpaid, jealousies that might have festered in silence. The answers came slowly, each one measured, each one shadowed by the fear of saying too much. Mr. Hanley, who had helped search, sat at his kitchen table, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. When the constable asked if he had seen anyone on the road that night, Hanley shook his head, his voice flat. No one but the Murphys. They passed me just after the dance. Michael nodded, but he didn't speak. The constable watched him, his gaze steady, but Hanley did not look up. Mrs. O'Reilly, her hands twisting a handkerchief, spoke in a whisper. Norah was quiet at the dance. She seemed troubled, but she wouldn't say why. I thought perhaps she was tired. The constable asked if Norah had quarreled with anyone. Mrs. O'Reilly shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. She was a good girl. They all were. The storekeeper, Mr. Baker, was called in next. He stood behind the counter, his fingers drumming on the wood. I saw them leave, he said, his voice brisk. They looked as they always did. Michael was in a hurry, but that was nothing new. The constable asked if he had seen strangers in town. Baker hesitated, then shook his head. No one I didn't know. No one who didn't belong. The questions turned to the men who had been at the dance, the young men who had watched Norah and Ellen, the ones who had spoken to Michael. Each was called in. Each sat stiff-backed in the constable's chair, their eyes darting, their hands restless. Some answered quickly, their voices too loud, their words tumbling over one another. Others spoke little, their answers clipped, their faces closed. One, a drover named Wilson, was asked about the crossroads. He described seeing the siblings, their faces pale, their voices low. They seemed in good spirits, he said, but his eyes flickered as he spoke, and the constable made a note. Wilson's hands shook as he left, his hat clutched tight. Rumors began to coil through the district, whispered in kitchens and at fence lines. Some said it was revenge, an old grudge come due. Others spoke of a stranger, a man seen once and never again, his face half hidden, his manner odd. A few, their voices barely above a breath, wondered if it was something darker. A ritual, a warning, a message meant for those who would understand. The constable listened to each theory, his face impassive. He asked about the arrangement of the bodies, about the care with which they had been placed. Some shuddered as they spoke, their voices faltering. It wasn't natural, one man said, his eyes wide. No one here would do such a thing. Another shook his head, his voice trembling. It was as if they were being watched even after. The police questioned the Murphys' friends, their neighbors, even distant relatives. Each was asked about grudges, about secrets, about things left unsaid. Some grew angry, their voices rising, their faces flushed. You think I could do such a thing? One man spat, his fists clenched. Others wept, their grief raw, their words tumbling out in a rush. They were like family to us. We would never... The constable watched them all, his eyes sharp, his manner calm. He noted the way hands trembled, the way eyes slid away, the way voices caught on certain words. He listened for the things not said, the silences that stretched too long, the glances exchanged when no one thought he was looking. A few men, those who had quarreled with Michael or envied the girl's attention, found themselves watched more closely. Their neighbors eyed them with suspicion, their greetings colder, their visits shorter. One, a farmhand with a quick temper, was questioned twice, his answers growing shorter each time. Another, a quiet man who kept to himself, was seen walking the road at dusk, his head down, his steps hurried. Theories multiplied, each more unlikely than the last. Some whispered of a passing swagman, desperate and wild. Others spoke of a lover's quarrel, a secret tryst gone wrong. A few, their voices shaking, wondered if the answer lay within the family itself, a darkness no one wished to name. The constable wrote it all down, his notebook filling with names, with times, with fragments of stories that did not fit together. He asked the same questions again and again, watching for a slip, a hesitation, a truth that might reveal itself in the smallest detail. But the answers remained elusive, the truth slipping away each time it seemed within reach. The people of Gatton watched one another with new eyes, their trust fraying, their words careful. The horror of the arrangement lingered in every conversation, a shadow that would not lift. And through it all, the constable moved quietly, his questions gentle, his eyes never missing a thing. He listened to the stories, the denials, the whispered fears. He watched the way people looked at one another, the way they avoided certain names, the way their voices dropped when they spoke of that night. No one confessed. No one broke. The fear grew, silent and patient, waiting for someone to make a mistake. But the district held its secrets close, and the truth, if it existed, remained hidden behind careful words and shuttered eyes. The investigation became a ritual of repetition. Questions asked and answered, statements written and rewritten, the same faces returning to the constable's table, their expressions growing more guarded with each visit. The police gathered in the back room of the hotel, their voices low, their tempers fraying at the edges. The senior sergeant, a man with a heavy brow and a habit of drumming his fingers on the table, read over the notes again and again, his lips moving silently as if the words might change if he looked long enough. Constable Murphy, no relation, sat with his arms folded, his eyes narrowed. "We are no closer than the day we began," he said, his voice flat. The sergeant did not answer, only tapped his pen against the page, his gaze fixed on the list of names. Another officer, younger, restless, shifted in his chair. "Someone knows," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're just not saying." The room was thick with the smell of tobacco and sweat, the air heavy with frustration. Each man carried his own theory, his own certainty, but none could make the pieces fit. The arrangement of the bodies haunted their thoughts, the deliberate care of it, the silence it imposed on every conversation. The sergeant closed his notebook with a snap. "We will go over it again," he said, and the men nodded, their faces grim. Outside, the people of Gatton watched the police with wary eyes. Neighbors who had once shared bread and laughter now crossed the street to avoid one another. Old friends found themselves speaking in half-sentences, their words trailing off into silence. The Murphys' tragedy had become a mirror, showing each person the shadow of suspicion in their own face. The constable returned to the Murphy house, his questions softer now, his manner almost gentle. He sat with Patrick, the two men silent for long stretches, the only sound the ticking of the clock. Patrick's answers were shorter each time, his voice hollow, his eyes fixed on the floor. The mother sat nearby, her hands folded, her gaze distant. She answered when asked, her words careful, her grief contained behind a wall of composure. The children watched from the doorway, their faces pale, their eyes too old for their years. They listened to the questions, the answers, the silences that followed. They learned to move quietly, to speak only when spoken to avoid the places where the adults gathered to whisper. The officers argued in private, their voices rising behind closed doors. One insisted it was a stranger, a man passing through, someone with no ties to the district. Another was certain it was someone known, someone trusted, someone who had walked among them for years. The sergeant listened to both, his face unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. At times the arguments ended in silence, the men staring at the floor, the weight of their failure pressing down on them. The constable would stand, his chair scraping the boards, and step outside to smoke, his eyes searching the horizon as if the answer might appear in the distance. The townspeople felt the strain. At the store, conversations stopped when a stranger entered. At the church, prayers were offered in voices that trembled. Children were kept close, their play subdued, their laughter rare. The Murphys' names were spoken less and less, as if to say them aloud was to invite the same fate. Some tried to move on, to return to the routines of work and worship, but the memory of the arrangement lingered. It colored every interaction, every glance, every silence. The men who had found the bodies avoided one another, their friendships strained by what they had seen and could not forget. The police continued their work, but the investigation slowed, the leads growing cold. The sergeant sent reports to Brisbane, his words careful, his frustration hidden between the lines. The replies came back, polite but distant, offering little more than sympathy, and the suggestion to continue inquiries. The constable visited the paddock again, standing at the edge, his hat in his hands. He looked at the place where the bodies had lain, the grass grown back, the earth undisturbed. He stood for a long time, his face unreadable, his thoughts his own. Back in the hotel, the officers sat in silence, their notes spread before them, their eyes tired. The sergeant spoke at last, his voice quiet. "We may never know," he said, and the words hung in the air, heavy and final. No one argued, no one offered hope. The silence that followed was deeper than before, a silence that settled over the district, over the families, over the men who had searched and the women who had waited. It was a silence that carried the weight of all that could not be explained, all that would never be spoken, and in that silence the fear remained, patient and watchful, waiting for the day when someone, somewhere, might finally speak the truth. Years passed, but the memory of that night never faded from the faces of those who had known the Murphys. In the homes where laughter once came easily, there was a new caution in every word, a pause before each story, as if the very air might betray them. The children who had watched from doorways grew into adults who spoke little of their childhood, their eyes clouding when the name Murphy was mentioned. Patrick Murphy's hair turned white in a single season. He moved through his days with a heaviness that never left him, his voice softer, his temper gone. He answered questions when asked, but his gaze always drifted to the window, as if he might see his children returning, their faces bright, their laughter echoing down the road. The mother grew thin and silent, her hands always busy, her eyes never meeting those of her neighbors. She kept the house as it had been, Norah's shawl folded on the bed, Ellen's hair ribbon tucked in a drawer, Michael's boots by the door. The neighbors too changed. Some grew suspicious, their greetings clipped, their visits rare. Others became fiercely protective, their loyalty to the Murphys a shield against the questions that never truly left. At church, the pew where the family once sat remained empty for months, a silent reminder of what had been lost. The priest spoke of forgiveness, of the unknowable ways of providence, but his eyes lingered on the faces of his congregation, searching for something he could not name. The men who had found the bodies carried the memory with them, their sleep troubled by dreams they could not share. Mr. Hanley, once quick to laugh, grew quiet, his hands shaking when he thought no one was watching. Thomas, the eldest surviving Murphy boy, left the district within a year, his farewell brief, his eyes shadowed. He never spoke of his sisters or his brother again. The constable, too, was changed. He kept his notes in a locked drawer, his handwriting growing smaller and more cramped with each passing year. He answered questions from new officers, from journalists, from strangers who came to Gatton seeking the story, but his answers grew shorter, his patience thinner. He walked the paddock sometimes, his hat in his hands, his eyes on the ground. He never found what he was looking for. Theories lingered, whispered in kitchens and at fence lines, but no new evidence ever came. Some said it was a stranger, a madman passing through. Others insisted it was someone close, someone trusted, someone who had known the Murphys' habits and chosen that night with care. A few, their voices barely above a breath, wondered if the truth was something darker still, something that could not be spoken aloud. The children who had once played with Norah and Ellen grew up and left Gatton. their memories of that summer fading into something like legend. When they returned years later, they found the paddock unchanged, the grass grown tall, the road winding away into the distance. They stood at the edge, their faces grave, their voices hushed. None of them stepped closer. In the Murphy house, the rooms grew quiet, the laughter and music of that last night replaced by a silence that deepened with each passing year. The mother moved through the house like a shadow, her footsteps soft, her voice seldom heard. Patrick sat by the window, his eyes on the road, his hands folded in his lap. The children's things remained where they had left them, untouched, waiting. The Gatton murders remain a wound in the earth, a place where time did not move forward. Even now, to speak of them is to feel the presence of something unfinished. The names of Michael, Norah, and Ellen linger in the air, their faces half remembered, their voices lost to the silence that followed them home. And in the quiet moments, when the house is still and the night is deep, it is said you can feel the weight of all that was left unsaid, pressing in from the darkness, waiting for someone to listen. If you have listened this far, you carry a piece of the story with you now, as all who have heard it do. The silence that followed the Murphys lingers still, and every voice that remembers them helps keep the questions alive. We invite you to share your thoughts, your theories, or simply the feeling this story leaves behind. What do you see in the silences, in the careful arrangement, in the faces of those left behind? Have you known a mystery that changed the way people looked at one another, or a story that was never truly finished? Let us know where you are listening from, and what you carry away from the tale of the Gatton murders. Your words travel farther than the horse tracks of Gatton ever could, and in sharing them you become part of the long, quiet vigil that has watched over this story for more than a century. Thank you for listening.